Welcome to the Vine Life podcast. We're a wholehearted community of Jesus followers, seeking God's kingdom in Manchester and beyond.
It's a privilege to be with you. As Ralph said, I'm a pastor in Salford. I've been a pastor for a long time. A long time. And but only in two churches. The first was in Guernsey. I don't know if you've ever been to Guernsey, but in the 1980s, yes, that's how long. In the 1980s, I was a pastor for 3 years in Guernsey. And in Guernsey, when you go to the town in your car and you park on the pier, you don't want to carry your keys around because they're quite bulky in your pocket. So you pop them in the footwell of your car, close the door, go and do your shopping. And when you come back, of course, your car is still there. For if they stole it, where would they go? On an island 9 miles by 3, you just walk and get it back again. And after 3 years being there, I moved to Salford, which was very similar in some ways. You're probably far too young to remember any of this, but the first Friday I was there, we were having a leaders meeting, and one of the leaders' cars got stolen from outside the church, which was covered in barbed wire and shatterproof windows. We were going for the seeker-sensitive look. And I was a very young pastor. I wanted to pray. I wanted to look like I was some sort of superhero. So we prayed, Lord Jesus, would you let these young lads switch on the cassette recorder in the car? You have no idea what that is, some of you. And listen to Graham Kendrick singing Make Way. It was even before Shine, Jesus, Shine. And that it would lead to saving faith. And anyway, we had to pray that prayer a lot of times in those days in Salford until we started praying a more psalm-like prayer, more biblical prayer. Oh, God, get them. During those what will be 39 years of being part of the leadership of that church next year when I hand it over to the next generation. There's been other things I've been involved with, as Ralph said, teaching in Bible colleges and working with pastors and leaders of churches around the place to help us work out how do we live out this faith in our very real world. In other words, how do we take this stuff and make it very relevant there? And I'm absolutely convinced that those two works of actually reading carefully and closely and then living faithfully are connected. And today particularly, perhaps as we look at this brilliant next passage in Mark that Ralph asked me to look at. In a moment, Kate is going to read it to us. It's chapter 13. It would be helpful if you have a phone to get your Bible app open at Mark 13 as we look at that this morning. Yeah. And as it's always interesting to come to a church that you've not been to before, I want to commend you for the biggest offering baskets in the world. I would be even more impressed if they're full, but they are, it just struck me, the largest in the world. But the thing I really wanted to say was this. As you read together, and as I highlight some things, will you remember those two songs that we've just sung, particularly? Because I kind of almost believe those two songs could be a commentary on the chapter we're just about to read. Katie's going to lead us with.
If you did want a Bible, Miles has got them. And Aldi, you guys have notes to be taken, right? Awesome. If you want a Bible, put your hand up. Miles will go round. Mark 13. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues, and you will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "Look, there he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in heaven will be shaken. And then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on guard, keep awake, for you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you all, stay awake.
That's kind of like a favorite verse of preachers, that last one. This passage is not without its complication. And some of us will have been brought up in Christian contexts where we will have seen part of that passage applied to the things that are happening around us. So every time there's an earthquake, or every time there's something bad happens, or there's a war, my mum, who's still alive, who's been a Christian, and brought me up in the Christian faith, will go, "Do you think this is the sign that Jesus is coming?" She's been asking me that question for 40 years. And for 40 years, I've said, it might be, Mum, but it probably isn't. And she's disappointed every time. But the good news about my mum is she's got 2 sons. And so she can ask the second son the same question. I think what Jesus is doing, and I think the message I'd want to sort of highlight, if you will, this is the sort of where I'm going to go with this, is the Christian life is one where we have fears, but we handle our fears differently. Okay, that's kind of like the headline. But in order to get there, and in order to make sense of this chapter, it kind of needs a bit of a close reading. Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll take themes out and simply make it, well, what about me? And when you do that without a close reading, you realize that in this chapter, there are certain things that don't seem to make sense. So we're going to do a little bit of a close reading, if that's okay, within the time I have. Let's just see how it begins. So the first thing is, there's one comment by the disciples. Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings. Now, to say the obvious thing, they're outside the temple. And did you do chapter 12? So you know all of that, because last week you did chapter 12, and it was all in the context of the temple. And the disciples are sitting there kind of like sort of lounging around going, hey, Jesus, are you not impressed by this? These are brilliant buildings, aren't they? And the point was that the temple dominated both the skyline and the imagination of the people of God or the people of Israel. The temple dominated the imagination because the temple, you will remember, was destroyed in the Old Testament and then rebuilt. And the rebuilding of it was a sign that God's amongst us. The temple was the touching point between heaven and earth. It's where God worked. It's like if we went to the temple, that's the Holy of Holies. It's the touching point between heaven and earth. Now, when you get to chapter 14 and 15, and you'll go through why Jesus was crucified, why did the Jews hand Jesus over to be crucified? One of the things that we mistake is Jesus didn't get crucified because he said to everybody, love one another. Be nice. No one crucifies people who say, be nice. That is not a charge that would kill you. What Jesus got crucified, the reason the Jews handed Jesus over to the Romans, or the Jewish leaders better, was because he said the old order has finished. You see, what Jesus was saying is, I'm the new temple. I'm the touching point between heaven and earth. Come to me if you want to get healed. You don't need to go to the temple. Come to me if you want to get forgiven. Come to me with your sin and I will cleanse you. You don't need the sacrificial system of the temple because I'm the touching point between heaven and earth. Now, I've not got the time to do this, but in brackets, follow that theme through into the rest of the New Testament. And what does Paul say to the people in Corinth? He says two things about temples. Firstly, you, individual, are the temple of the Holy Spirit, and we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. The temple still operates, but it's us now, the touching point between heaven and earth. And we do that everywhere we go. So Jesus says, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. That's the response. It's the old order is gone. The temple will be destroyed. And Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, tell us, when is this going to happen? And what will be the sign that they're going to be fulfilled? Two questions. When will it happen? And what will be the sign? And Jesus said to them. So we're reading a text, a chapter, that is not written to us. It's a chapter that records Jesus speaking to them. And then that chapter is given for us, but not to us. Does that make sense? And I think it's really important because otherwise, if we think it's written to us, we'll start to struggle to find where we are in the story. But if it's for us, we go, oh, well, that's interesting. So if that's what Jesus said to them, what might he say to us? And it won't be the same thing. Because Jesus spoke these words in around 28 AD. There was a Jewish war in 66 AD, and the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. Now, the disciples want to know when's it going to happen. And Jesus said, no one knows. But we know. Because it's already happened. Because it happened in AD 70. And so what this rest of the chapter is, well, what's going to happen up to that moment? What's going to happen to the generation, the disciples' generation, up to the temple being destroyed? And Jesus says, well, this is what's going to happen. There will be internal pressure. You will have false messiahs coming. So don't be deceived. What do false messiahs do? They come and go, I'm here now, everything will be fine. It's hard not to remember Andy Burnham signing on as a new MP, and someone in the chamber shouted, he's not the Messiah. And he said, no, just a naughty boy. False messiahs, I'm not suggesting Andy Burnham is a false messiah, but false messiahs always promise more, because what false messiahs do is tell people what they want to hear. That's what false messiahs do. And Jesus said, watch out, don't be deceived. Secondly, there will be wars and there will be natural disasters. That is not the sign of the end. He explicitly says it. Mum. There will be, he says, in that generation, there will be earthquakes, there will be wars, there will be natural disasters. This is not the sign of the end. You, he says to his disciples, will be under pressure. Locally, they will take you in front of the synagogue and exclude you, and nationally, you will go before rulers. However, the gospel will be preached, so don't be afraid, because the gospel must be preached to all nations in verse 10, and you will be helped to speak this. Now, those of you that are Christians and have been around a little longer and read the book of Acts know that's exactly what happens. They go before the synagogues try to exclude them, but the gospel goes out. Paul gets saved remarkably. Paul ends up in front of Rome and the Roman rulers there, and so the gospel has reached both the hub of the empire, and through Paul and the early church, the gospel starts going to every nation. Because once you reach Rome, you reach the heart of the communication hub. And then finally, your families, Jesus says to his disciples, will reject you, and they will split over this, but keep going, because you will be saved. So that's what Jesus says when they start to say, what's it going to be like? But then Jesus goes on in verse 14, and that's where it starts to get a lot more difficult. My mum's never asked, is the abomination that causes desolation around yet, Neil? But Jesus says in verse 14, when you see, and in all of your texts it will have quotation marks next, the abomination that causes desolation. And that, you don't need to be clever, you just need to read a footnote, is from Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament. Now, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament was written to people who were in the context of an empire that wasn't allowing them to be free to worship. And one of the things that Daniel both saw and was equipping people for was a time when the empire would start to impose its rule over worship. And the abomination that causes desolation was in a time of a ruler called Antiochus, who brought idols into the temple. Now, you still see this today. If you want to assert your authority or your power over a religious group, what would you do? You would go and spray a swastika on the outside of a synagogue. you would take a whole bunch of pork chops and you'd put them in the doorway of a mosque. Because you would say, we know what you value and what is important to you, but we want to dominate you. That's the abomination that causes desolation. And Jesus says to his disciples in verse 14, when you see that, it's happening again, Daniel. It's happening again. When the Romans come and start putting their standard bearers in the temple, it's happening again. When the Romans are overcoming you and they're putting you in your place, it's happening again. Verse 15 to 19, when there's a siege and there's a rise of popular liberators, don't follow them. But if you're in Judea, get out if you can. And then in verse 24 to 25, I'm having to go quite quick because of time, but in 24 to 25, in those days, following that distress, what's the distress? The attack of Jerusalem and the beginning of the fall of the temple. In those days, following that distress, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, the heavenly bodies will be shaken. What you've got is a poetic language that everything will be shaken. It's kind of like, when we talk together about it was an earth-shattering event. What we mean is so significant. We don't actually mean that the earth shattered. It's a metaphor. And what Jesus is doing there, and what Mark's recording, is from Isaiah, where God does something and the world changes. What did they see? Well, they would see the destruction of the temple, and at that time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Again, sorry if I'm going too fast, but again, this talks about Daniel's vision. Now, the problem is when we read that at the time, people will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with power and glory. We think that's Jesus coming down. Daniel saw it as the Son of Man going up to the place of authority before the Ancient of Days. So essentially what Jesus is saying is three things. People will see what I've said, Jesus will be saying, is right. Secondly, when the temple is destroyed, they will know that actually this world-shattering event, which if you were Jewish absolutely was the beginning of some new thing. It's the beginning of birth panels. Something new can be born. And the new thing is the worldwide spread of the church. And he finishes it. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Which generation? Not ours, theirs. When's it going to happen? No one knows. Jesus was so unhelpful sometimes, wasn't he? No one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son. Jesus is going, I don't know when it's going to happen. But the Father knows. So be on your guard, be alert, stay awake, and watch. That's what he said to the disciples. Right. Ralph invited me to come along to talk about something that's got nothing to do with us. Thank you. So what? So what? So you read that chapter. Now this is where the danger comes in, isn't it? You go, well, a lot of that simply doesn't have to do with us, does it? So I'll go back to where there's earthquakes. You just pull out the bits that you think might fit. Nowhere to read the Bible. If you do that, you'll end up with all sorts of odd stuff. So stay within the text. This is about the temple. But of course, you've been reading the Gospel of Mark. You know the whole of the Gospel of Mark was written for the next generation of Christians. None of the Gospels are simply doing the life story of Jesus. What they're doing is they're preaching to you. And what they're preaching to you is, can you understand who Jesus is? The next generation and the generation after that. Can you see who Jesus was? So what's it to do with us? Well, intriguingly, were we reading Matthew's gospel, I'd need another 10 minutes for this sermon. Because Matthew does two things. He says, let me tell you about what's going to happen when the temple falls, and now let me tell you what's going to happen when the Son of Man returns. Mark doesn't do that, but Matthew does. And what Matthew says is, it's the same attitude as the first generation of disciples, which is needed by the last generation of disciples. In other words, what did the first generation of disciples, what were they told to do? Because it'll be the same all the way through history. In other words, that generation become like a template for us, an example of how to live when there's a lot of fear around. When actually you feel fear. When you wonder, are things spinning out of control? And Jesus speaks to disciples like us, and he outlines, how do we wait? Well, this is how we wait. We wait in the same way as the first disciples. We wait and we are unafraid. Now, fear and anxiety grip us, generationally grip us. And some of you will struggle with anxiety and fear more than others. Don't be condemned by that, but recognize it. And recognize that your walk with Jesus might be a lifetime of that voice of fear and anxiety getting quieter as the voice of Jesus gets louder. What I'm almost convinced about is it doesn't change overnight with a prayer. But what I do think happens is that you begin to trust the voice of Jesus more than you trust the disaster voice that says it's, that catastrophizing. How do we wait? Well, we wait unafraid. We wait with no panic. We wait with resolve and resilience. We keep watch and we're ready. We're ready for what God does. I love the idea of you sort of hanging out whenever you're going to do it on Burnage Road, and next week, the week after, who knows when you're going to do it. But I love the idea of just sort of hanging out on the main road, stopping the traffic, presumably, and just telling people, listen, you might want to come and join us because we are the people who are aware of what could be feared, but we've learnt a new way of dealing with our fear. We're aware of what could be feared, but we've learnt a new way of dealing with our fear, and it's an ancient way. I think what Jesus is saying to his disciples is this: don't be entangled in false hope, and don't be paralyzed by false fear. Don't be entangled by false hope. Don't be paralyzed by false fear. Jesus never said to any of his disciples, don't worry about this, I'm going to take you out of this situation. He said, no, it's going to be quite tough. And if God hadn't sort of shortened the days, who would know what happened to you? Most of our prayers as Christians is, oh, God, get me out of here. And most of those prayers, God doesn't seem to answer, eh? Yeah? Very rarely. How many of you have prayed about work and gone, God, get me out, it's horrible there, it's toxic. And God seems remarkably quiet. And the next job you apply for, you don't get. And you go, well, I thought you were on my side, God. And God says, I am. But my job is not to get you out of every difficult situation you face. Now, that is not good news, is it? It'd be a much easier sell for other people who are not yet Christians to go, become a Christian, you'll never have a fear or worry or concern or difficult day again. The gospel doesn't say that. What the gospel says is there are many things that could frighten you. There are many things that do frighten you. Don't be entangled in false hope. But don't be paralyzed by a false fear. And a false fear is no one's in control. No one's in control. That's where false fear comes. No one's in control. God's not in control. I'm just trying to hang on in by my fingertips here. No one's in control. The false fear that speaks, it's I call it the 3 o'clock in the morning fear. You know that moment when you wake up in the middle of the night and no one else in the world is awake except you, and all you can do is go over your false fears, or even worse, Google your false fear. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning you go, I was right to be frightened. I'm dying. And then you wake up in the morning and it's just, no, it's hay fever. It can paralyze you. Let me finish with this. This is a quote by a writer called Jamie Smith. To be a Christian is to be a person who engages with society but does so without fear. Fear drives us to panic, and no one makes good decisions when they're panicked. We overestimate some threats and ignore others. We can't see clearly, and we're prone to being manipulated by those who would stir up our panic. But we ought not to be a panicked people. Our King has told us over and over again, be not afraid. You have already heard good news that brings great joy. The King is alive and seated on his throne, and he reigns. And not only that, he's interceding for us at the right hand of his Father. Be not afraid. Let me say this finally. If you read this gospel account, this gospel chapter, you've got to make a decision. And it's a fairly simple decision. When Mark wrote this gospel, was he telling the truth about what Jesus said? Or was he making it up? If he's making it up, then ignore it. Because all you've got then is a legitimate reason to fear the power of those who seem to hold all the cards. If Mark is making it up, they were right to fear Rome, and God was not in control, and things would spin into catastrophe. However, if you believe Mark was telling the truth about what Jesus said, then not only did Jesus know what was going to happen, he would speak into the fears that he knew that generation would have. And he would speak into what would be the good news of the liberating new kingdom that would come, because the King and the new temple are reigning. One of the fundamental truths of Christianity is this: that Jesus died, he rose, and he ascended, and is sitting at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us. So we talk a lot about forgiveness through the cross. We talk a lot about the resurrection life and the power of the Spirit. But actually, it's that last part of that sort of triumvirate that you want to hold on to. Jesus is ascended. If Mark is telling the truth, Jesus is ascended at the right hand of the Father, interceding for you about your fear, about the things that you are frightened will go wrong, about the things that you think, if that collapses, it will be earth-shattering. I don't know how I would get through. Because he did it for the disciples, and he says it to us. Be not afraid. Stay awake. Watch what God does.
Hope you enjoyed today's message. If you want to find out more, head to our website vinelife.co.uk or find us on socials at vinelifemcr. God bless, and we hope to see you soon.